For years, the truth stayed hidden, the victims forgotten, the cases left cold, until science revealed what time could not. This is decades in the dark, where cold cases are brought back to light. On the morning of February 24th, 1986, John Ruetten came home to the Van Nuys condo he shared with his wife, Sherri Rasmussen. Sherri was only 29, a gifted intensive care nurse, director of critical care at Glendale Adventist Hospital, admired for her leadership even at a young age. She and John had been together for about 2 years, before marrying in November 1985. Friends described them as happy, with plans for a long future ahead. Just 3 months into that marriage, John stepped into a nightmare: a shattered sliding glass door, a ransacked living room, and upstairs, Sherri, brutally beaten and shot 3 times. Detectives called it a botched burglary. Sherri's BMW was missing, later found abandoned about a mile away in Van Nuys. Electronics sat oddly untouched. It looked random. It wasn't. Years earlier, before meeting Sherri, John had dated an ambitious LAPD officer named Stephanie Lazarus. They met at UCLA in the late 1970s and were together on and off for years, though the relationship was never exclusive. When John finally ended it and moved on, Stephanie did not. Even after John began dating Sherri, Stephanie kept showing up. There were confrontations. Once, Stephanie appeared at John and Sherri's condo while John wasn't home, demanding to know if Sherri really thought she could keep John. Sherri was shaken. Another time, in the parking lot at Glendale Adventist Hospital, Stephanie confronted Sherri face to face. According to Sherri's father, Sherri came home upset and told him that Stephanie had warned her, "If I can't have John, nobody else will." Sherri confided that she was scared, afraid Stephanie was stalking her and trying to intimidate her into leaving the marriage. When Sherri was murdered, her parents begged detectives to look at Stephanie, but their warnings were brushed aside. Detectives insisted it was a burglary gone wrong. After all, Stephanie was a police officer, one who had passed psychological testing to join the LAPD and built a promising career. The file gathered dust. For John, the years that followed were marked by grief. He was shattered by Sherri's murder, but unlike her parents, he did not press investigators to pursue Stephanie. He tried to move forward, burying the trauma, and yet, his past with Stephanie wasn't fully gone. In the early 1990s, several years after Sherri's death, John reconnected with Stephanie. By his own admission, they had a brief sexual encounter. He later said it was a mistake, an echo of their college relationship. Prosecutors would argue that this showed Stephanie's obsession never faded, and that John's continued contact complicated the picture for investigators. It wasn't until the mid-2000s, when the LAPD formed a dedicated cold case unit, that Sherri's murder was looked at again. New detectives pulled the file in 2005. With DNA science advancing rapidly, they began re-examining unsolved homicides for evidence that could finally be tested. The bite mark on Sherri's arm had been swabbed back in 1986, even though DNA technology was still years away from being practical in court. That one piece of preserved evidence would change everything. When tested, the DNA from the bite mark pointed to a woman, a startling revelation. The so-called burglars that detectives had once blamed didn't fit. The violence was personal. Investigators looked again at Sherri's background, her relationships, her fears. And one name surfaced again: Stephanie. Detectives set up surveillance. They needed a fresh sample to confirm what the decades-old bite mark suggested. They followed Stephanie to a Costco, where she finished a drink and tossed her cup into the trash. Detectives scooped it up. The saliva DNA was tested. The results matched perfectly. 23 years after the murder, the truth surfaced in a lab report. Here's how investigators believe the crime itself unfolded. That morning, after John left for work, Sherri stayed home. Stephanie arrived at the condo, not as a stranger, but as the ex who couldn't let go. Entry was either forced or opportunistic, but what followed was a direct confrontation. Words turned to shoves. The fight surged through the living room, up the stairs. Furniture scraped, items toppled. Sherri fought back fiercely, leaving bruises and defensive wounds. In the chaos, Stephanie bit down on Sherri's forearm, an angry, personal act that left behind the DNA profile which would one day expose her. Upstairs, the fight reached its end. Stephanie struck Sherri, then pulled a .38 caliber revolver. 3 shots tore into Sherri's chest. The young bride was gone. Afterwards, Stephanie staged the scene to look like a burglary. The sliding door was smashed to simulate forced entry. Drawers were pulled, objects disturbed. To sell the disguise, she took Sherri's BMW and later abandoned it in Van Nuys, not far from the condo. Soon after, she filed a report in Santa Monica claiming her personal .38 revolver had been stolen from her car. Prosecutors later argued that this was no coincidence. Her gun matched the caliber of the murder weapon, and by declaring it stolen, she gave herself an alibi for why she no longer had it. The file went cold. Stephanie advanced inside the LAPD, working in units that investigated thefts and homicides, her badge shielding her from suspicion. By all accounts, she was respected, athletic, and dedicated. She came from a close family in Simi Valley, raised with strong ties to her parents and siblings. For those who knew her professionally, the idea that she could commit murder seemed impossible. And then the DNA broke the silence. When word spread that Stephanie had been arrested at LAPD headquarters, co-workers were stunned. Colleagues described feeling betrayed, some saying it was like a punch to the gut. A decorated officer, arrested in the very building where she had once investigated other people's crimes. At trial in 2012, John took the stand. He testified about his college relationship with Stephanie, about meeting and falling in love with Sherri, and about the confrontations Sherri had endured. He admitted the later encounter with Stephanie, a detail that prosecutors said revealed her grip on him and her inability to move on. Prosecutors painted two sides of Stephanie: the officer who kept her composure in uniform, and the jealous ex who lost control that February morning in 1986. The jury heard about her threats to Sherri, the staged burglary, the conveniently stolen revolver, and the DNA that connected her to the crime. After just 2 days of deliberation, they found her guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence, 27 years to life. For Sherri's family, justice had taken 26 years. They had always believed Stephanie was the killer. Science finally proved them right. Sherri was remembered as a compassionate nurse, a loving daughter, a woman whose life and marriage had only just begun. John, devastated, later said that part of him never recovered from the day he walked into that condo. Today, Stephanie remains behind bars. In 2023, she became eligible for parole, but after an initial grant, the full parole board rescinded it. Sherri's family and John spoke at the hearing, urging the board to keep her locked up. Commissioners agreed, citing Stephanie's lack of honesty about the crime. She is still serving her sentence, with another parole review scheduled, but as of now, she remains in prison. A life stolen by jealousy and rage. A family's warnings ignored for decades. And finally, the undeniable truth revealed by science. This is Decades in the Dark, where science brings the past to light. Subscribe for more stories where justice never expires.